White male! White male! You're all white male! I've done nothing, I've done nothing.
On the 27th of October 2016, the UK Conservative government's minister responsible for equalities was asked why her office had no plans to acknowledge International Men's Day, an annual campaign designed to celebrate the contribution of men and boys and help to highlight some of the challenges they can face throughout their lifetime. Her response was to sidestep the question by proposing that women could be forgiven for thinking that every day is International Men's Day. Caroline Denage's dismissive and diversionary response echoed rhetoric employed 12 months earlier by a member of the Parliamentary Oversight Committee for her very Equalities Office. On that occasion, Labour MP Jess Phillips reacted to a proposal to mark International Men's Day in Parliament with flippancy, palpable anger and unbridled ridicule, attempting to first block the event entirely, and when this failed, she continued to undermine the notion of a parliamentary-backed initiative to discuss significant gendered inequality of outcomes from the pages of the national press. When less than a third of their UK parliamentary colleagues are currently female, the concept of addressing disadvantage or issues predominantly impacting on boys and men may very well seem counterintuitive to some. But in an era when government ministers are often very publicly admonished for perceived slights and clumsy language directed at female colleagues, it does seem significant that elected members of Parliament from across the political divide, with a shared responsibility for matters of equality no less, should feel so comfortable evoking such starkly gendered rhetoric to undermine the very notion of setting aside one day in the year to champion the causes of men.
Implementation arrangements will look like and over what timescale is also very important. But I would urge her not to be hysterical about these things. Many companies are making contingency plans.
Chancellor of the Exchequer accused me of being hysterical. Can we have a ruling from you in the chair, Mr. Speaker, as to whether this sort of sexist language used to diminish women who make a perfectly reasonable point, that is the sort of language that would not be used had I been a man? My question on the registration of companies in Ireland had nothing to do with the condition of my womb travelling to my head, as is the traditional hysterics rhetoric. I expect that sort of language from the sketch writers of the Daily Mail, not from the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
You have to excuse me for laughing, that the idea that men don't have the opportunity to ask questions in this place is a frankly laughable thing. As I say, as the only woman on this committee, it seems like every day to me is.
Well, I wasn't making, with respect, I wasn't making that point. I wasn't making the point that men don't have an opportunity to ask. I was about men's issues. There's a very big difference between men raising issues and the raising of men's issues.
But one could raise men's issues in any single one of the question sessions. So men's health, absolutely. So prostate cancer, that could be raised in men's questions, couldn't it?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I very much look forward to these arguments being deployed when we come to consider a debate on International Women's Day, because exactly the same arguments could be raised for International Women's Day, that women's health issues, that equality issues could be raised in women and equality questions in other forms. So all I ask is for an equal crack of the whip, that if those issues can be raised without having a debate on International Men's Day, then obviously the same issues can apply for when it comes to International Women's Day, but those arguments have never won the day before this committee.
I just think that it's worth pointing out the idea that this chamber, that these houses, both of them, in any way reflect gender equality is to me a frankly laughable thing. And so in the fight for equality, I'm not sure the men on this list necessarily have that much to fight for. I don't care about men's issues, it's that I'm hoping for parity myself.
Hear, hear.
I absolutely care about men's issues. And when I've got parity, and when women in these buildings have parity, you can have your debate.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, if I can just make the point,
and that will take an awfully long time.
I'm not requesting a debate on representation within the House of Commons. I'm asking for debates on men's issues, and the list of issues I gave earlier, I would like to think people can recognise are genuine issues and actually are very, very rarely debated in the House of Commons. Very rarely debated in the House of Commons.
Many people in public life still do follow the somewhat eccentric, some might say archaic, example set by two highly paid public servants and equality champions alike.
And thank you for that wonderful entrance. Typical, of course, 10 men blowing their own trumpets before a woman even so much as opens her mouth.
But inevitably, the general public are becoming increasingly aware that inequality between the sexes is no laughing matter, and nor is it something exclusively experienced by women and girls. And crucially, they also believe that the action so obviously needed to address the challenges and often very gendered inequalities experienced throughout the lifetime of a boy must happen in parallel and in partnership with actions needed to address the very significant challenges experienced by girls. Because every day is most certainly not International Men's Day for every man or boy. And as many fathers and mothers will sadly know, on average in the UK, every day is currently the last day for 13 men and boys who tragically take their own lives. Meanwhile, rising levels of educational underattainment is by now probably the other most commonly and comfortably acknowledged gendered inequality on the male side of the fence. Indeed, the Higher Education Policy Institute recently estimated that if current trends continue, a girl born in post-Brexit Britain will be 75% more likely to go to university than a boy. The director of the institute pointed to a collective blind spot around the underachievement of young men, which he described as a national scandal. And yet, such reality is entirely consistent with global trends, and policymakers in many OECD, or more commonly known as Western countries, have become particularly concerned about the prospect of a growing underclass of undereducated men, with teenage boys now 50% more likely than girls to fail to achieve basic proficiency in maths, reading and science. Meanwhile, 50% more women are now entering higher education than men in America, Britain, and parts of Scandinavia. So you'd think this would be a priority issue for the most senior equality officer in the land.
The gender pay gap has been eliminated for women under the age of 40, and we have more female graduates entering the workforce than ever before. I'm sure none of you here in this room would ever think that the women you know were any less capable because of their gender. That attitude needs to spread far and wide. The fact remains that you as men are still far more likely to wield positions of power and influence. You're more likely to be on company boards, to be CEOs. In other words, more likely to shape the culture and ethos of the places you work. From the classroom to the boardroom, we have to start earlier than the workplace, though, if we're to empower young men and women to achieve their full potential and champion equality. The Your Life campaign, launched last year and supported by government, will help map out a future in STEM careers for girls up and down the country, from GCSEs to A-levels to university and beyond. And we've recently published a guide for parents called Your Daughter's Future to help parents understand the choices young people face today and empower them to make the best decisions for their children, regardless of their gender.
Now, some do seem to have adopted a fairly simplistic and stereotypically masculine competitive perspective as to what this all means. In quiet moments, they may even whisper the possibility that, in spite of all the systemic disadvantages that women still face, maybe the fact that our girls are out competing the boys so brilliantly and in so many areas is simply the empirical evidence of something some have argued since they made the first grade. Maybe girls really are simply and considerably better than boys. Maybe the future really is female. But then again, maybe such a childish and so obviously self-serving mantra is the gendered equivalent of calling for a white ethno-state. My name is Brian, and I have a background in equality and psychology, and the glass blind spot is a term I use to describe the phenomenon where people consciously or unconsciously ignore information relevant to a discussion about equality and human rights because it would distract or detract from their preferred narrative. We all have our own personal perspectives and prejudices, but a glass blind spot is so big that a fucking elephant could hide in it. And in my humble subjective opinion, the highly statistically significant trends relevant to boys and the implications they have for generations of women and men in Great Britain and much, much further beyond are arguably the single biggest collective blind spots hidden within the complex and increasingly competitive spectrum of equality matters today. Education and mental well-being may very well be the two most widely acknowledged male inequalities, but there are of course many others, because just like many women, many men become some of the most marginalised, disadvantaged and desperate people in society. In Great Britain, 95% of our prison population are men, as are 88% of rough sleepers. And men are more likely to experience premature death at every single stage in life. Now, in fairness, it is becoming increasingly acknowledged that boys and men can and do experience gendered inequalities in their sometimes all too short lifetime. And yet, the concept of men's issue, or whisper it, men's rights, are still all too easily ridiculed, or worse still, dismissed as being somehow anti-women. Meanwhile, conversely, as a society, we also seem to be nurturing an ever-increasing general overall problem with men.
Is the bloodstain on my jeans more embarrassing than the thinning of your hair?
Yes, I have thought an awful lot about blowing up the White House.
And the purpose of this series is to attempt to unpick this particular paradox. A wise man once said that the best way to eat an elephant is one small chunk at a time. And in similar fashion, week by week, chunk by chunk, Problems with Men aims to point a finger at different challenging and often complex problems that people have with men that combine to create one massive elephant-sized obstacle that should be the concern of anyone committed to the notion of championing equality and human rights for all. Problems such as pathologizing perceptions and problematic projections of privilege, power and patriarchy. Problems like conscious and unconscious prejudice that can have significant implications for politics, public policy, and how the state spends the shared resources that have been predominantly prized from the pay packets of men. Probably the most pressing problem that some people will have with such a project is the instinctual concern that it might somehow detract or distract from important work undertaken to address disadvantages experienced predominantly by women and girls. And so I want to state clearly that this is an entirely legitimate concern to have, and one that will be addressed. Human rights for all is not an exhaustive or mutually exclusive matter, and consequently the rights and fates of both sexes are inevitably and inextricably linked. The concerns of men and women are complementary, they are a shared experience, and it is as unrealistic to set them in competition as it is to think it's possible to poison half a well. The very vast majority of the world's billionaires may very well be pale, stale and male, but such rhetoric also oversimplifies a very complex situation and denies the reality of many men whose experiences straddle practically every intersection of every possible characteristic, and consequently any concept of equality becomes meaningless when they are ignored. Just by way of example, life expectancy of a poor man in Great Britain can be up to 17 years lower on average than an affluent woman. Disabled men experience domestic violence at similar rates to non-disabled women. Male children are more likely to have a disability, and approximately 80% of people who undergo gender reassignment were identified as male at birth. Black British men are twice as likely to get prostate cancer and experience a higher incidence of mental illness than white British women. And the worst level of educational underattainment is currently experienced by white working class boys. Real equality can only be achieved when there is cooperation and complementary developments between men and women, which is based on mutual understanding and respect. Problems with Men aims to consider some of the complex reasons why even high-profile gender equality champions and highly paid public servants can sometimes be so dismissive, even openly hostile, towards initiatives throwing a much-needed spotlight on the challenges faced by boys and men. The primary purpose of this project is to consider the available evidence of gender stereotyping, prejudicial attitudes, and systemic barriers negatively impacting on the lives of boys and men and women who love them. By highlighting them, I hope to encourage a greater emphasis on the need to challenge and counter damaging and distracting rhetoric, as well as make some small contribution towards shifting that elephant-sized obstacle which is causing massive problems for anyone currently involved in the vital work of addressing the very real problems faced by men and especially boys in this complex and changing 21st century world. Starting with the notion of male privilege, each short video will consider a particular problematic perspective about men and will be accompanied by open source show notes with links to relevant citations and additional resources so that viewers can dig deeper, read further, and ultimately make their own mind up about how to overcome our shared problem with men. And of course, where to point the finger first.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.